Welcome to TED Grudin for this fifth episode of Philosophy Gets Personal. It's my great pleasure to have you today. Ted is the environmental humanities specialist at Santa Clara University in the Department of Environmental Studies and Sciences. His work revolves around how people understand themselves in relation to nature. Something super, super interesting and very helpful. Thanks for accepting my invitation today, Ted.
It's my great pleasure.
How did you manage, or how do you manage to look at nature from nature points of view, if this is a direction you took with you? Because I read that you are trying to cleanse somehow the interpretation of the environment from an anthropocentric human point of view. How do you do that? It's extremely difficult and useful, like I'd say.
Well, it's a project that's been done in various different ways from various different fields, and even religious approaches that potentially sort of decentralize the narrative from humanity. It's not, in some ways, it seems almost impossible to do because your ideas, even if they're as extreme as possible, they're still coming from a human brain, a human mind. And so that aspect of the sort of anthropocentric, human-centered approach is really, potentially impossible to avoid on some level. But on the other hand, remembering that not all life and not all meaning has to be derived from, this species, this singular kind of life form, that there are other living things on this planet that may have their own kinds of meaning that they create at every given moment. So it's very hard to imagine that. Might have trouble entering the consciousness of other beings, but we can at least try or imagine something like that.
Do you use any phenomenology in doing so? What philosophical approach do you use?
I've always been interested in phenomenology because of how it's centered in experience. And I think that, I don't know, a lot more can be understood from that perspective, but I don't specifically employ that necessarily in my work, although it's something I'd like to do more of.
And an example to give back the narrative to nature. How can we see this? How can we train our mind to this?
Well, in a few of my classes, I've led a very simple experience for students where they are asked to go outside and find one living plant and focus on that plant for 5 minutes quietly. And that's a long time to focus on one plant. But for a plant, it's not a long time. I don't think they experience time in such a different way. But by doing so, by spending that quiet time focusing on one singular living plant, you can really see a lot more potentially than you normally would just walking by that stationary object. The reason I employ this experience for my students is that I myself had a special experience with a very sort of dilapidated shrub that I found near Baker Beach in San Francisco. I spent, maybe around 5 minutes just, looking at and observing that plant. And I noticed that as dilapidated and sort of sad as the plant looked, it was actually this amazing study in resilience, and that it was doing all these things that I wasn't giving it credit for. It was swaying in the wind, so it was kind of, managing the weather pretty well, and but it was also, it was eating from the soil, it was drinking from the water, it was breathing from the air, it was exhausting, it was inhaling and exhaling. And it was in some sort of process of reproduction, which I probably didn't understand exactly what part of that it was in. But
Yeah,
yeah, it was doing all these things all at once while it was sitting there in the soil. And it really changed my perspective on plant life. And, since then, I've spent a lot more time thinking and writing about plants.
that's really beautiful. Uh, how can you see? It's even difficult to ask questions because I realize that every question would be a reference to the way in which I think, because I'm tempted to ask you about the intelligence, the emotions of plants, the sociality of plants. But I know that these are human parameters.
Yes, there are scientists looking into these questions,
Mhm.
and theorizing and making some pretty fascinating discoveries and claims. I'm not an expert in those fields, but I think there's a lot more to look into, and a lot more discoveries to be made along those lines. And we do share a lot in common with plants. It's not entirely far-fetched to look for commonalities, and shared experiences, even as as wild as that might sound. They're not aliens to us. They're more like relatives to us, literally and figuratively.
Why did you bring forward the term Petrolocene? What do you mean by this?
So I took a graduate seminar on the concept of the Anthropocene, and a number of professors at UC Berkeley and their grad students just spent, a semester toiling away at different analyses and critiques of that idea. And what came to my mind is
Can
the
you
idea.
tell us, sorry, our listeners, what do you mean? What is Anthropocene?
So the Anthropocene is a relatively new term in the last, 25 years or so. And I forget the exact date. A couple scholars started writing about it. And it's to describe the geological epoch of that is sort of dominated by anthropos, or humanity. And so the idea is that the planet has been fundamentally altered by human societies. And so when I was thinking about that, I had a few issues there, realizing that without the use of fossil fuels, the story would have looked entirely different on this planet. And that fossil fuels themselves were such powerful agents um, in this narrative and in this transformation of the planet. And so I wanted to emphasize them. So the Petrolocene is a way of talking about the age of fossil fuels. And it's, somewhat of a critique on the idea of the Anthropocene. But it's, I when I write about it, I think about, the kind of society-wide addiction that humanity has had with fossil fuels, and how much they have altered pretty much every aspect that I can think of not just human life on Earth, but life on Earth to some extent. And so it's something that, yeah, I'm still thinking about and, sometimes giving talks about.
Do you think that there's a way back from it? Because the problem of Anthropocene is that it says, okay, humanity altered our era in such a way that we cannot come back, we cannot change anything. Is it the same for your concept of Petrolocene? Uh, is there a way in which we can make up for the mistakes we made?
Mm, there have been some interesting ideas put forward about the next phases or eras that could come about. And I do think a lot of healing will happen. There will be a transition and a change away from the Petrolocene. The world will look very, well, fundamentally altered. It already does, but it's going to be even more fundamentally different than it is now. But there will be new ways that people connect with the planet and live here in vibrant communities and ecosystems. But there's a lot of transitional phases that are going to happen along the way. That's the way I look at it.
Do you have in mind the transitional phases? Which ones could they be, or they just a vague idea, or?
Some of them are um, pretty dark visions. Some
Mhm.
times I think ahead that are going to be very challenging for humanity on Earth. And not to say it's not very challenging right now for hundreds of millions of people. It very much is. And
Yeah.
the climate crisis is playing a huge role in that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Now that we managed to paint a very dark picture of where we are and what we did, now I can ask the question, how does happiness look like for you? What is happiness? Because, yeah, this season of the podcast is verges somewhat around happiness and what you value in life. Having the conscience of what we did and how difficult it is to connect with the environment and how smaller we are making our chances to connect with nature, what makes us feel good. Um, can How is happiness still possible? What's the source of happiness for you?
For me, I feel the need to base my happiness in a realistic vision of my life and the broader world around me as much as I can. I feel that it's a solid foundation for a life with well-being when you've already made a strong attempt to reconcile the challenges and the painful aspects that are part of our lives or my life, or, mainly speaking for me. In a lot of ways, happiness is such a situational, personal um, kind of thing that everyone has a different pathway towards what they see as their happiness. But for me, I really feel the necessity and the importance of coming to terms with heavier, sadder things so that I can build the foundation that won't crumble when those things rear their heads.
And was there ever a moment in which you felt that now it's really hard to achieve, to choose happiness, because you felt that you lost something, or something valuable was taken away from you in your life. Um, did that ever happen, a situation like?
Very much so. I had a very special dog in my life. I actually got him in one of the toughest years of my life, which was my first year of my PhD program. And he was like, he was a ray of sunshine. His name was Sunny, spelled with an O, but he was also like Sunny, spelled with a U. And he was this half boxer, half golden retriever that I adopted from a family in the East Bay in the Bay Area. And he was about 1.5 when I got him, and I had him for about 12 years. And we had a very special bond and connection. He was very personable. He would look me straight in the eyes and really communicate in ways that I've never really been able to communicate with many dogs in that way. And he understood the English language pretty well. If I told him, please go sit in your chair or go sit outside, he would actually know what I was saying.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my favorite biology professors at Cal, once we were chatting, and he mentioned that dogs are almost better at sensing human emotion than humans are, and I think that's probably the case. There's a more instant. They instantly know how we feel, and in a lot of situations. But I lost him in December, which I was one of the most painful experiences of my life. It was very hard to actually do it.
Eh.
But also, once he was gone, for weeks, I was lost in sorrow. I was lucky because it was winter break for my students, and so I had some time to
Mm-hmm.
to actually grieve. It would have been
Mm-hmm.
harder if I had to just go to work during that time, but I grieved for many weeks, and I had some very supportive friends who understood, because not everyone understands
Oh yeah.
the bond someone can have with their pet. Um, Maybe the way it felt was like he was this person I cared for, sort of like some sort of child that I cared for. And you're not supposed to outlive your child, so it's the loss. It just doesn't make sense, and it feels wrong. And you have to make the decision for your pet a lot of the
And
time.
you have to make the decision, which is really
Yeah,
cruel and necessary at the same time. I experienced also the loss of my 17, she lived, year-old dog, and making the choice, deciding now it's time, is impossible. It's almost irrational, because you want to see only what good it is, because you don't make this choice for your relative. I mean, hopefully in your life, you will not be called to decide, okay, now you lived enough. It's time for it's clement for me to decide to let you go. And also, as you were saying, it's your child, but then it becomes your grandmother, your grandfather, because there's this strange time relationship with them, for which they start as little kids, but then they teach us also what it means to age,
yeah.
to feel pain and so on.
Yes.
And again, it's coming back to what you were saying at the beginning, it's hard to give the narrative back to them, because um, they they in the society as it is, they cannot make this choice. You have to make a super. I felt it as a betrayal when I mean, okay, I helped her to transition to hopefully something better because she was in lots of pain. But at the same time, I mean, the last sight, it felt like a betrayal. I still don't know how to come at peace with. I didn't want to adopt another dog afterwards. Yeah, it's. I don't know. I didn't resolve this problem in my head.
Mm. The only thing I could do was think about what would I want in his situation, and um,
Yeah.
I made the idea came to mind that would I want a beautiful, happy last week or day, or would I want 10 years of or 10 months of extreme pain? And that was the only way I could come to terms with helping him not suffer anymore, because it was so hard to, like you said, to have to it does feel like betrayal, because you can't ask them what they want and they can't make that choice
No.
on their own, and they're just going to go along with the person
Mm,
they love, which is you, and
yeah,
they're
I
going to
trust
trust
you.
you.
Mm.
Yeah. And but he had a beautiful final day, and
Oh, I'm glad.
there was no pain for him that day. And he even got to see the sun, which he loved.
Mm.
That was very important to me, that he didn't, his last day wasn't rainy,
Mm.
because he didn't really like the rain, and I wanted him to have a beautiful last morning, and he did. And so, yeah, but in some ways, the experience also deepened my gratitude and happiness overall, because I realized, life is this finite thing, extremely
Mhm.
short. Um, and he somehow feels like he's still with me.
Mm.
And, he'll be in my heart for as long as I live, and he'll be on my mind and in
Mhm.
my thoughts for the rest of my life. And so in some ways, and the time we shared, those years, they exist in the universe somehow still.
Mhm.
And they
Yeah.
always will. And so if that weren't the case, nihilism would feel much more appropriate. But I do
Absolutely.
believe that, the time in the past somehow exists, um, for eternity, somehow. I don't know, it's some intuition or some wishful thinking, um, but yeah.
Yeah. The time is with him.
Mhm.
And do you share? I mean, is there any other way in which I don't know, animals, nature can give you comfort, company, and so on today, or uh, you took distance a little before getting again
Yeah, I haven't
companion?
been able to get another pet yet. Someday I very
Mhm.
much look forward to having, more cats or dogs
Mhm.
in my life, but I'm taking a little breather because it was such an intense experience, and I can never replace the relationship I had with Sunny. But
No, no, it's
he
impossible.
taught me so much. He was one of the best mentors, and like you said, in some ways, he was my grandparent at the end, and he was my teacher. And I learned so much from him, and my students learned from him too, because I was able to share some of the things I learned. And I'm forever grateful to him. You know, yeah, he's
One of the lessons he taught you?
there are so many. I think he taught me about the depth of meaning beyond the human sphere, because ability to stay in the moment and hold space and presence with
Yeah.
me was so profound. And he had so much love and so much joy for life. And he accepted my care so thoroughly. I remember one time he was running around, having a great time on the top of this hill in Claremont Canyon and sort of Oakland, Berkeley border. And he was jumping around and he jumped over a log and he hit, a branch because he just miscalculated or didn't see it. And it took a big chunk of his fur and a little bit of skin, just ripped it off. And I thought he had broken his leg because he was just crying, and
Mm-hmm.
it was very painful to see. So I just picked him up and I carried him all the way down the hill, which was very steep. And then when we got home, I put some antibiotic ointment on there, and it turned out he didn't have a broken leg, which was a big great thing. And he was consoled and he was cared for, um, and it was so special to be that person in his life. But again, just there was just so much depth to this. I want to call him a young person because he
Yeah.
was a person, and then he kind of, in some ways, he was signaling to me that there's more meaning beyond in other animals, other species, and also beyond animals in other
Mm-hmm.
life forms, whether they be, mushrooms, plants, bacteria.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I even think about you know, the vibrancy or the
Mm-hmm.
energy that's in, quote unquote, inert matter, because there is so much happening in every, molecule and atom, and going further down the line, into particles and stuff. But there's so much energy and just fascinating stuff going on with quote unquote inert matter.
Mm-hmm.
So, which I'm not trying to say that, that your definition of life would have to change to say that, that concrete is living matter. But it's interesting to think about, the activity that's happening in every molecule, for example. But
Yeah,
um,
life is not necessarily what you see.
mm,
It's there's concreteness that is invisible and is very much alive, but invisible to human eyes because it's there and it's alive, and we don't know exactly what's going on, but it's there.
mm,
Yeah.
mm.
And why was your first year of PhD so difficult? Because I remember you said that Sonny entered your life during this first year. What was going on?
It was just a perfect storm of different challenges that I was facing in my life. Uh, Loneliness, the challenge of Berkeley grad school, which I think uh, I could have never been fully prepared for. The
Mhm.
intellectual challenges there, but there's also the social challenges of and the learning to communicate and get along with um, um, lots of intense people, and uh, and and the professors
Yeah.
there. But it overall, the people were so lovely, and I learned to really enjoy the community there. But yeah, it was a tough year, um, and I got to see a fair amount of darkness. I lived by myself in this cabin that was kind of in the woods,
Oh God.
and uh, and I really, the dog was what was missing. He he brought the sunshine to the place, and after that, it was never the same in a very positive way.
Mhm.
And the funny thing is, shortly after getting him, I lost him for 36 hours.
Oh, that's
And
horrible.
yeah, because he was hanging out with me and some friends on campus, actually. And then he just sort of, at one point, just disappeared. And he had been there for hours and then he disappeared. And for 36 hours, I couldn't find him. I looked everywhere. But he somehow, with his intelligence, with his just, um, you know, he found his way back more, like basically a mile up this hill. He had never even maybe done the walk before, but he found my place. He
Oh,
came back, and I'd only had him for a month. So
wow.
he came back to me. There was already a bond after a month, and it was almost like he was very hungry and thirsty, so that's a big part of it. And he had some ticks on him, and so he'd had some fun out there. It was his
Too
night out,
much.
his night and day out on the town. But he came back, and it I knew that I'd never let him go missing again. Like it was a big lesson,
I
and after that day, yeah, I never let it happen again.
I
So
still have nightmares. I mean, my dog is gone. Now it's been 4 years. I still have nightmares that I miss her, that she disappears, and I don't know what to do. And I don't know if now we are indulging over this, but I don't know if you had that feeling of for 17 years, I felt I had the responsibility over her life to keep that life safe and comfortable and healthy and integer and so on. And they take the body when the dog dies. When I saw her brought away from the doctor, it was weird because there was a little part of me that felt okay, I completed the task of being responsible for that little body that was so precious for so many years for me. I don't know if you felt that kind of responsibility over him through the years.
yes, I mean it's hard to explain how it
Yeah,
felt
it's hard.
to to you know he went to sleep. He was so peaceful. I tried to speak to him during those moments, and yeah, it did feel wrong when he left the room, and you know he wasn't under my care anymore.
Yeah.
Um, it's a strange way that this society deals with the end of life, even with our pets. And I mean, there's different ways people approach these things with both people and pets, but you know, a lot of diversity in how people approach these things. But they're also, maybe the majority of how it's done is um, very specific or unique and different from other approaches. So yeah, it's an oddity how much people hide death from themselves, and I think it doesn't do us a service for our own happiness,
Yeah.
because I think we should be aware of the brevity of life. And I think for a lot of my life, I felt like everything was just a preparation or an audition or a practice for something real in the future. I think I share
Mm,
this. I think a lot of people must feel this way. That's the way it feels to me, is that
me too.
almost, yeah, during our whole lives, that is kind of an idea that's put forward, like during schooling, like, oh, this is, you're in your 8th grade play. That's maybe for a minute it feels like the biggest thing in your life, but it also is sort of like, well, it's a middle school play, and then you start to look at it as well. It's just all an audition for something in the future. And the question is, well, when are you going to stop being in an audition or a practice? And when are you going to realize that, this is something to embrace as the real thing, the actual thing, the actual experience, and that it is rather short, and that you have to do the best you can to find the meaning and beauty in your experience, because that's what you have in life, right?
I don't know if I think about what you said, the moment in which I felt that I stopped this sense of preparation. I remember distinctly, maybe I wrote it also in my journals, that it all seems like a preparation too. Um, it seems that this feeling stopped when I started embracing fears and desires, when I said, okay, it's good to let everything go, all these things that makes me feel secure, and to embrace. For example, I always loved, but really loved doing research. But I always thought that I was not good enough, capable enough, the whole thing. And so I started applying like hell. I didn't get any position, of course, but I started trying and trying and trying. And the closer I got to what I thought I was, but I didn't dare to believe that I was, something like that, the more this sense of getting ready to faded, and I thought, and I stopped thinking about it. And then a meaning came up, because then you start coming in contact with how beautiful it is to be part of life, to contribute, to bring meaning, to share it with others. Yeah, that's a really good point you brought, which brings us to generally the last question, the last difficult question of this podcast, which is, what do you think is the meaning of life, if there is a meaning?
When I was first teaching, I designed a course called Literature of Environmental Apocalypse, and students were excited about it because, it sounds like, a dark sci-fi movie. But by the end of the class, one of the classes, I asked everyone in the room, I said, do you feel hopeful or sad, lack of hope about the future after, everything we've talked about? And almost everyone was pretty down about the future, their future, or future of life on Earth. And I said, okay, this is not the kind of messaging or feeling that I want my students to leave one of their final courses in college with. Because even if they're connecting with something that is realistic on some level, it's not going to be helpful for them. And well, hopefully they found a way to turn it into something helpful for them. But what I decided to do was to shift around the course and call it environmental hope. And
Nice.
what I did though, is I didn't want to take away the dark stuff at the beginning. So I left a fair amount of apocalyptic material at the very beginning. And then we spent the rest of the quarter exploring, creative ways to be hopeful and optimistic about the world despite the apocalyptic realities. I sort of maintain the idea that the meaning of life is to live. But of course, that's such a vague way to say it. but when you think about it, what does it really mean to live, to be alive, to be aware, to feel, to connect with the world around you, the people in your life, the sad things, the happy things, the sweet things, the delicious things, the amazing smells, the beauty around you. There's just so many, and everybody's situation and the way they interact with the world is unique. And so this is different for everyone, but I think the simplest answer is that, the meaning of life is to live, but you have to look into what the attributes of living that give you meaning, basically. So there's an existential task in the meaning of life. It is for you to connect with that, and every person will have a unique approach to that process. Yeah.
Thank you, Ted. This is really, really beautiful. Thanks. It was a great pleasure for me to get to know you a little bit better today.
Me as well.